People picture New Zealand a certain way. Rolling green hills, sheep outnumbering people 20 to 1, fjordland mist, a haka for the tourists at the marae down the road, a flat white in a converted villa in Ponsonby. That is the postcard. I have lived here my whole life, and I will tell you the postcard is not a lie. It is just not the whole photograph. Because scattered across both islands, in paddocks and pine plantations and the edges of towns that used to be bigger than they are now, there are buildings the brochures never mention. Old psychiatric hospitals. Places where thousands of New Zealanders were sent, sometimes for reasons that had very little to do with actual illness, and where some of them never came out. Some of these buildings are still standing, fenced and boarded, waiting for a district council to decide what to do with them. Others are nothing now but foundations under grass, and a paddock nobody quite wants to plough too close to the edges of. The staff who worked in these places, even now, decades on, mostly don't want to talk about it. Not because nothing happened, because too much did, and because some of what happened has only in the last few years been formally acknowledged at all, by a royal commission, and by a Prime Minister standing up in Parliament to apologise for things this country spent half a century pretending it did not need to explain. Tonight I'm taking you through 10 of them, from the top of the South Island to the lower reaches of the North. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 10. Ngawhatu Hospital, just outside Nelson at the top of the South Island. Most people driving the Wangamoa route out of Nelson have no idea what sits back off the road, half swallowed by macrocarpa trees that were planted deliberately to screen it from view. Ngawhatu opened in the early 20th century as an overflow site for the Nelson Mental Hospital, and by the 1950s it was a self-contained institution with its own farm, its own laundry, its own graveyard, holding several hundred patients drawn from across the top of the South Island, from Golden Bay through to Marlborough. The official history describes a progressive rural asylum, a place where patients worked the land as a form of therapy. That much is true. Patients did work the land. What the official history says less about is that many of them worked it without pay, for years, sometimes for the whole of their adult lives, and that the institution's finances depended on that labour more than anyone likes to admit. The dairy herd, the vegetable gardens, the laundry that serviced the whole site, all of it ran largely on patient labour, costed at close to nothing, a fact that surfaces occasionally in old health department budget papers, but almost never in anything written for the public. Former staff interviewed years afterward have described a hospital that, on paper, nearly broke even most years, a figure that only makes sense once you account for how little the institution ever paid the very people doing most of the physical work that kept it running. Ngawhatu closed in stages through the 1990s. Some buildings were demolished, others were left standing, and locals in the valley say that even now, real estate agents avoid mentioning what a section used to be next to. A cemetery on site holds hundreds of graves, many marked with numbers instead of names. Numbers, not names. Whoever made that decision left no explanation on record, and nobody currently responsible for the land seems eager to revisit it. In the early 2000s, a small group of former patients and family members petitioned the District Health Board to have the graves properly identified and marked, a process that took years and, by most accounts, is still not fully finished. The buildings that remain are quiet in the particular way that only a building built for a very specific, very sad purpose can be quiet. The land remembers what it was for, even if the people who could tell you the details are mostly gone themselves. Number 9. Tokanui Hospital in the Waikato, not far from Te Awamutu. Tokanui opened in 1912 as one of the largest psychiatric institutions in the country, built to relieve overcrowding at other hospitals, which tells you something about the scale of the system before Tokanui even existed. At its peak, the hospital housed over 1,000 patients across dozens of buildings spread over more than 200 hectares. It had its own dairy farm, its own orchard, its own power station. It was, in effect, a small town built entirely around the containment of people the rest of society had decided it did not know what to do with, complete with its own social hierarchy among staff, its own sports teams, and, for a period, its own small cinema for patients and staff alike. A detail that sits strangely alongside everything else on the site's record. The Crown Health Financing Agency, when Tokanui finally closed in 1998, described the closure as part of a broader shift toward community-based care. That is the polite phrase. What it does not say is that some of the people discharged from Tokanui in those final years had spent 30, 40 years inside, had no family contact left, no community waiting for them, and no real plan beyond a small flat and a support worker who visited twice a week. Several former patients did not survive the transition long, a fact acknowledged only obliquely, years later, in a handful of academic studies on deinstitutionalization outcomes, rather than in anything the health system itself ever put its own name to directly. The main administration building still stands today, boarded and fenced, and contractors who have done demolition work on the surrounding structures over the years report the same thing independently. An unusual number of personal effects left behind in the walls and under the floors, spectacles, letters, a child's shoe in one recorded case, as though people who lived there for decades were, in the end, moved out faster than anyone accounted for their belongings. Local historical societies have since tried to catalogue what has been recovered, but without names attached to most of it, cataloguing is really all that can be done. The objects survive. The stories that go with them mostly do not. Number 8. Kingseat Hospital, south of Auckland near Karaka. Kingseat opened in 1932, built in the Spanish mission style that was fashionable at the time, which is a strange thing to consider now, because the architecture is almost cheerful. Red tile roofs, cream plaster, arched verandas. It looks, from a distance, like a resort. It was not a resort. Kingseat operated as a psychiatric hospital for over 60 years, and during that time it became, alongside several of the institutions on this list, a site the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care would later examine in detail. The Commission's final report, released in 2024, documented patterns of physical restraint, seclusion, and medication used well beyond what would be considered clinically appropriate today, across the psychiatric hospital system as a whole, with Kingseat named specifically among the sites where former patients gave evidence, some of it concerning a locked ward that staff at the time referred to, informally, by a nickname that survivors say was never meant kindly. Kingseat closed in 1999. Since then, parts of the site have been redeveloped into a housing estate, which means there are now families raising children on streets built where wards used to stand. Some of the original buildings were retained and repurposed, including the old administration block, now used for community functions. Others were simply demolished. Local historians say the developers were careful when marketing the new subdivision to avoid using the word hospital in any of the promotional material at all, favouring softer language about heritage character and established grounds. You can walk through that subdivision today and see architectural fragments preserved as a kind of feature, a nod to heritage, with almost nothing on any plaque to tell a visitor what actually happened inside the buildings those fragments came from. A handful of former patients, interviewed for the commission, said they still cannot drive past the site without pulling over. One woman, giving evidence decades after she had left Kingseat as a teenager, described the strangest part of returning as an adult, not the buildings themselves, but the ordinary sound of children playing on a cul-de-sac built almost directly over what had once been a locked ward, a detail she said she thought about more than almost anything else from her testimony. If that one settles uneasily, wait until we get to number 2, because the pattern we're about to see at Kingseat, the gap between what the record says and what the people who lived through it remember, only gets sharper the closer we get to the top of this list. Number 7. Cherry Farm Hospital at Waikato, north of Dunedin. Cherry Farm was built in the early 1950s specifically to replace an older institution that had been destroyed in a fire I'll come back to shortly. It was designed on the colony model, a series of separate villas rather than one large building, based on the theory that smaller, more domestic-feeling units would produce better outcomes for patients. In some ways, this was a genuine attempt at reform, and some former staff interviewed decades later did describe Cherry Farm as gentler than the institution it replaced. In practice, though, The villa model also made oversight harder because it spread staff and supervision thinner across a much larger footprint of land. And incident reports from the period show that isolated villas, some of them a considerable walk from the main administration building, went for long stretches with minimal direct supervision at night. Cherry Farm closed in the early 1990s as part of the same deinstitutionalization wave that closed Tokanui, and later, Kingseat. Today, most of the villas are gone, demolished or collapsed, but the farmland is still worked, and the workers on that land say they regularly turn up foundations, old drainage pipes, sections of tiled flooring, and paddocks that show no other sign of ever having held a building. There is no comprehensive public map of where every villa once stood. The Otago District Health Board's records from the period are incomplete, a fact confirmed by historians who have gone looking for them. And what that means practically is that nobody today can tell you with certainty exactly how many separate structures existed on that land, let alone what happened inside every one of them. Whether that gap is simple bureaucratic neglect or something more deliberate is a question that depends very much on who you ask. What is not in dispute is that Cherry Farm, like most of the institutions on this list, produced far more paperwork about its dairy production figures and its farm accounts than it ever did about the individual welfare of the people it was actually meant to be caring for. A mismatch in priorities that shows up again and again once you start comparing archived records from site to site. Number 6, Porirua Hospital, just north of Wellington. Porirua opened in 1887 and quickly became one of the busiest asylums in the country, a status it held for most of the following century. By the 1940s, it was significantly overcrowded, a problem the hospital's own annual reports acknowledged at the time in language that, read now, feels almost clinical about its own failure. Accommodation pressure necessitates measures which are not, in the committee's view, ideal. That is an institution admitting in its own official paperwork that conditions were bad, and doing so in the driest possible language. At times during the 1940s, the hospital held close to double the number of patients its wards were originally designed for, according to figures buried in departmental reports from the period. Porirua also holds a specific, uncomfortable place in New Zealand medical history. It was one of the sites where insulin coma therapy and, later, various forms of psychosurgery were practiced well into the 20th century, treatments that mainstream medicine has since abandoned entirely, and that a number of former patients, interviewed many years afterward, described as having left them permanently changed in ways nobody at the time properly explained to them, or, in some cases, to their families. Most of the original Porirua hospital buildings have been demolished, and a much smaller modern mental health facility, Te Wea Ahuru, operates on part of the original grounds today under a completely different philosophy of care. But the cemetery from the old hospital remains, tucked into bush at the edge of the property, and it holds several hundred burials, a portion of them, again marked only by numbers. Family members researching relatives who died at Porirua have, in a number of documented cases, only been able to locate a burial site decades after the fact, and only after formally requesting archived hospital records that were not made publicly available before that. One family, after years of searching, discovered their relative had been buried under a name misspelled so badly in the original register that no ordinary search would ever have found it, an error that either reflects extraordinary carelessness or, as the family themselves eventually concluded, something closer to indifference about whether the record was ever meant to be found again at all. Number 5. The old Auckland Lunatic Asylum at the Whau, later known as Oakley Hospital, and today partly absorbed into what is now Unitec's campus in the suburb of Point Chevalier. This is one of the oldest institutions on this list, with parts of the site dating to 1867 when the New Zealand government of the day decided the colony needed a purpose-built facility for what contemporary documents openly called the insane, rather than continuing to house such patients in general hospitals or, in some earlier cases, in jails. By the 1880s, the Whau housed several hundred patients from right across the wider Auckland province, some of them transported by ship from as far away as Northland, because there was, at the time, Simply nowhere else for them to go. Some of the Victorian-era buildings from that original asylum still stand, heritage listed, repurposed as lecture halls and offices for a polytechnic that most students walking past every day know almost nothing about. Ask a Lunatic student what Building 41 used to be, and you will mostly get a shrug. A few know. Fewer still know that the site's earliest burial ground, used for patients whose families either could not be located or did not claim the bodies, was only formally identified through archaeological survey work decades after the institution itself had already changed names twice. First to Oakley, later folded administratively into the wider Carrington Hospital complex next door. The bones came first. The explanation came much later, and even now it is incomplete. A small commemorative plaque was eventually installed near the site, decades after the fact, a gesture that some descendants of patients say came only after considerable sustained pressure from the wider community. Even now, the plaque makes no mention of numbers, of how many patients actually died and were buried on that ground over the decades the asylum operated, an omission that historians researching the site say was a deliberate editorial choice made late in the process, for reasons nobody involved in approving the final wording has ever been willing to fully explain on the record. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help, and that they make sense. It costs you nothing. And it tells me this kind of history is worth continuing to tell properly, rather than leaving it to gather dust in a Royal Commission report. Almost nobody outside the survivors themselves has actually sat down and read cover to cover. Number 4. Sunnyside Lunatic Asylum, in the Christchurch suburb that still carries its name today. Sunnyside. It opened in 1863, making it one of the very earliest purpose-built asylums in the country, predating even the Whau by 4 years. At its peak in the mid-20th century, Sunnyside held well over 1,000 patients, and it became, alongside Porirua, one of the 2 largest psychiatric institutions in New Zealand, drawing patients from across the entire South Island east coast, from Kaikoura down to South Canterbury. The 2011 Canterbury earthquakes badly damaged much of what remained of the original Victorian structure, and in the years since, most of the surviving 19th century buildings have been demolished on safety grounds. A decision heritage advocates fought and lost, arguing at the time that demolition was being used as a convenient excuse to erase a history the city would rather not maintain. What stands today on part of the site is Hill Morton Hospital, a modern mental health facility, operating under an entirely different clinical model than its predecessor. But the demolition of the old buildings surfaced something the earthquake in a strange way forced into the open. Contractors clearing rubble found sealed rooms in at least 2 of the older wards that did not appear on any surviving architectural plan the Canterbury District Health Board could produce. One contractor, quoted in a local newspaper at the time, described opening a section of wall expecting empty cavity space and instead finding a fully finished windowless room roughly the size of a small bedroom, bricked in from the corridor side, with no light fitting, no door, and no obvious means of entry from anywhere still standing at the time. The wall came down. Nobody currently working in the mental health system in Christchurch can tell you, with any confidence, what those rooms were originally used for, or why they were sealed rather than simply repurposed like everything else in the building around them. Number 3. Seacliff Lunatic Asylum, on the Otago coast north of Dunedin. Seacliff opened in 1884 and was, at the time, the largest building in New Zealand. An enormous Gothic structure of dressed stone that looked, deliberately, like something between a cathedral and a fortress. The architect, Robert Lawson, designed it to be imposing, on the theory, common at the time, that the scale of the building itself would have a calming, ordering effect on the minds of the people inside it. The building's tower alone was visible from the main coastal road for kilometres in either direction, and older Otago residents still speak of it, even now, as a kind of landmark their grandparents used for giving directions, without ever fully explaining to children what the landmark actually was. On the night of the 8th of December 1942, a fire broke out in Ward 5, a locked female ward. 37 women died. Most of them could not get out because the doors were locked from the outside. Standard practice for that class of ward at the time, and by the time staff reached the doors with keys, the fire had already taken hold. It remains one of the worst institutional fire disasters in New Zealand's history, and yet it is not widely taught, not the way the Tangiwai rail disaster or the Napier earthquake are taught, despite a broadly comparable death toll. A court of inquiry was held afterward. It found the locked door policy to be, in its own words, regrettable but consistent with accepted practice of the time, a conclusion that satisfied almost nobody, then or since, and that changed almost nothing about how such wards operated elsewhere in the country for years afterward. Some historians researching the fire decades later have noted that the names of the 37 women were not initially published in full, a decision the hospital justified at the time as protecting patient privacy, though families researching relatives affected by the fire have since argued it also had the convenient effect of protecting the institution itself from closer scrutiny. It would take further decades and considerable effort from local historical societies rather than any government body before a complete list of the victims' names was finally compiled and made publicly available in one place. Seacliff itself was demolished in stages through the 1950s and 1960s, following structural concerns and subsidence in the land it was built on. Though locals will tell you the land had been unstable from the very start, and that the builders knew it, almost nothing remains today except foundations, overgrown with gorse, and a small, difficult-to-find memorial that most visitors to the Otago coast drive straight past without ever knowing it is there.
Number 2, Templeton Hospital and Training School, on the outskirts of Christchurch. Templeton was different from most of the institutions on this list, because it was built specifically for people with intellectual disabilities, rather than psychiatric illness, a distinction that mattered enormously to the families involved, and that the system of the time routinely ignored. It opened in the early 20th century and, by the middle of the century, held several hundred residents, many of them children, sent there sometimes for disabilities that today would be considered mild or manageable, and sometimes for no diagnosable disability at all, but simply because a family or a doctor of the era decided the child did not fit. Some residents, according to testimony given decades later, arrived as toddlers and did not leave the institutional system in any form until well into adulthood, having spent essentially their entire childhood inside its wards.
The Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care heard extensive testimony specifically about Templeton, and its final report documented, in careful, restrained official language, patterns of physical abuse, chemical restraint, and in some testimonies, sexual abuse of residents, spanning decades and multiple different periods of the institution's operation. The report is a public document. Anyone can read it. What it makes clear, more than any single detail, is scale. This was not a handful of isolated incidents at one site, but a systemic failure across the entire model of institutional care for disabled New Zealanders that operated largely unchallenged for most of the 20th century. The Commission also noted specifically that complaints raised by staff members over the years were, in a number of documented instances, either not escalated or actively discouraged by more senior management, a pattern survivors say allowed conditions to persist for far longer than they otherwise might have. Several former staff members who did eventually come forward, decades later, described a workplace culture in which raising concerns was treated less as a duty and more as a form of disloyalty to colleagues, an attitude that outlived several changes of management over the institution's long operating history. It is a pattern this list has already shown more than once, and it will not be the last time it appears before we are through.
Templeton closed fully in the early 2000s, later than most of the other sites on this list. A fact that in itself says something about how long it took the system to admit what was actually happening inside these places, even after other similar institutions had already shut their doors. Some of the land is now used for housing. Former residents and their families have, in the years since the Commission's report, called for a memorial on site. As of this recording, none exists. Number 1. Lake Alice Hospital, near Martin, in the Rangitikei district of the Lower North Island. Of everything on this list, Lake Alice is the one where the official version and the real version are furthest apart.
and where the gap between them has been most thoroughly, most painfully documented. Lake Alice operated a child and adolescent unit from 1972 through 1978, under the direction of a psychiatrist named Selwyn Leeks. Children as young as 9 were sent there, some for genuine psychiatric conditions, others for behavioral issues, running away from home, or simply being difficult teenagers in an era with very little patience for difficult teenagers. Some were sent there directly by the state's own child welfare system, a fact the Royal Commission later described as one of the clearest examples in the entire inquiry of an institution meant to protect children, instead becoming the site of some of the worst harm done to them. What happened to many of them inside that unit has since been the subject of a police investigation, a United Nations finding, and finally, in 2022, a formal apology from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, delivered on the floor of Parliament, acknowledging what survivors had been saying for nearly 50 years and had, for most of that time, not been believed. Electric shocks were administered to children as a form of punishment rather than treatment, applied to the hands, the genitals, and other sensitive areas of the body, not under anesthetic. Paraldehyde, a sedative with an extremely unpleasant physical effect when injected, was used in the same punitive way. The official hospital records from the period describe these as treatments. Survivors, when they were finally believed decades later, described them using a different word entirely: torture. A 2001 police investigation into the unit ultimately resulted in no criminal charges, a decision that survivors have spent the years since actively, publicly contesting, and that the Royal Commission's final report treated with considerable and explicit skepticism regarding how thoroughly that original investigation was actually conducted. Some survivors eventually received government compensation, decades after the events in question, a process many of them have described as its own kind of ordeal, requiring them to relive and justify their own abuse to bureaucrats who had no memory of any of it, filling out forms and giving statements to case officers who, in some cases, had not even been born yet when the events in question actually occurred. Selwyn Leeks died in 2022, the same year as the Prime Minister's apology, having never faced criminal conviction for what took place under his direction. The unit itself was demolished decades ago. Nothing marks the site today except paddock grass, and, depending on who you ask locally, a reluctance that has never fully gone away to say exactly where, on that stretch of Rangitikei farmland, the building actually stood. If you have visited any of these sites, or if your own family has a connection to one of them that I have not mentioned here, I would genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. This is exactly the kind of detail that official histories tend to leave out, and it only survives if people who were actually there, or whose parents and grandparents were, choose to pass it on. I have had comments before, on other videos on this channel, from people who worked as orderlies or nurses at some of these very hospitals decades ago, and who said, almost every time, that it was the first time anyone outside their own family had ever asked them directly what they saw. That tells you something about how long this particular silence has been allowed to sit undisturbed. What strikes me, having spent time researching all 10 of these places, is not really any single detail, awful as some of them are. It is the pattern. 10 different institutions built across more than a century, in completely different parts of the country, under different governments and different medical theories. And yet the same failures keep appearing. Doors locked from the outside. Records that go missing exactly when they would matter most. Graves marked with numbers instead of names. And decades of silence from staff who, even now, mostly decline to speak on the record. New Zealand likes to think of itself as a young country, an honest one without the buried history that older nations carry. These 10 places suggest that is not quite true. We built entire towns for the express purpose of putting people somewhere out of sight, gave those towns their own farms and their own laundries and their own cemeteries. And then, when we were finished with them, we mostly just let the buildings fall down and hoped the silence would do the rest of the work for us. It very nearly did. It took survivors speaking up for decades, sometimes not being believed for most of that time, before a royal commission and a prime minister's apology finally put some of this on the official record. The land under these places does not forget, even when the paperwork does. Somewhere out there, right now, sheep are grazing over foundations nobody has mapped, and families are still trying to find out where exactly a grandmother or a great-uncle actually ended up. That is not ancient history. Some of the people who could tell you the whole story are still alive, and some of them are only now, for the first time, finding people willing to actually listen. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.